Hi, thanks for joining me in our webinar about how to peer review a review article. To briefly introduce myself, my name is Matt Pavlovich. I'm the editor of Trends in Biotechnology. We're a monthly reviews journal published by Cell Press on the topic of applied biology in all of its various forms. You can get in touch with me with my email address here, and I encourage you to check us out on Twitter at Trends in Biotech. So, broad scope, I'm going to start by talking about how review articles are different from research articles. And maybe you already know part of this, but I think probably the most important and the most obvious thing is that there's no methods or data in reviews. There are some exceptions for unusual review formats like meta-analysis or the systematic review. Reviews are broad. We're taking a lot of the different aspects of the literature and synthesizing them rather than being narrowly focused on one question. And therefore, we expect them to be read by a wider audience. In particular, they might be used as teaching tools, or if a new person is joining a lab or starting a research project in a new field, they might read the review to get up to speed. The novelty in a review, rather than discovering something or observing or creating a new thing, is in having something new to say. And in some cases, in some journals, a review article can only be submitted either with an invitation from the editor or by prior consultation and discussion with the editor. So what does that mean if you're peer reviewing a review article versus a research article? And I want to say that the rest of the presentation assumes that you know at least some of the basics about how to be a peer reviewer. If you're completely new to peer review, that's fine. We have a lot of really great resources on Researcher Academy and on the Cell Press blog Crosstalk that I encourage you to check out. Some similarities. So first thing, be professional, objective. These are your colleagues whose work you're reviewing, and they're also reviewing your own work. And so just make sure to maintain some collegiality. You want to understand what the journal is asking for. So every journal has different guidelines, expectations, but it's not necessarily your job to police the format. You also don't need to copy edit, so you don't need to be overly concerned with the author's grammar or punctuation, those sorts of things. You really want to work with the editor in all cases. If you think that you're going to have a delay, if you agreed to review something, but it turns out that you can't do it anymore, that's fine. Just make sure that you let the editor know. And in all cases, you are trying to improve the manuscript. It's not your job as the peer reviewer to give a reason why it shouldn't be published. You're trying to make sure that the journal publishes the best content that it can and making sure that the authors put their work out there in the best way they can. But we do have some differences. I would say maybe the most important one is that in a research article, you want it to be accessible, you want to communicate it well, but this is essential for review articles. So a review article that is not easy to interpret really serves no purpose at all. There's no methodology, data analysis, statistics to evaluate in reviews. So if you accept an invitation to review a review article, you're not being asked to say, whether the author's numerical conclusions are right or whether they've used the right statistical tests. Back to this point about novelty. So we're looking at how the authors are choosing to discuss the field rather than the results that they found. Do they have a new perspective, a new way to analyze old data maybe? And it's also really important to distinguish consensus from author opinion. So if the authors are writing a review to advance their hypothesis, that can be a really interesting thing for the field, but they need to make sure that they say it's our hypothesis rather than it's what the whole field believes. And finally, timeliness is a really big deal. You can have a research article that talks about a topic that's been investigated recently, and it can still be interesting. But if we have a lot of reviews on the same topic, it's going to dilute the impact of all of them because they might not all have different things to say. We'll talk more about those guidelines about how to specifically review reviews in a few minutes, but I'd like to start by talking a little about who might be invited to review a review. And generally, the answer is anyone who might submit to the same journal. So if you have recent publishing or research expertise in the topic, especially if your own work has been cited in the review manuscript, then you're probably going to be an excellent reviewer. There's a lot of misconceptions floating around about the author recommendations for reviewers. And I want to assure you that the editors do take author recommendations into account. I personally always invite the suggested reviewers unless I have a good reason not to. And a good reason might be they're already reviewing for the journal or they just recently did, and I don't want to overburden the person. If there's an obvious conflict of interest, or if I review the person's expertise and I don't think it's quite right for the manuscript. I never invite an opposed reviewer. So if you have a good reason to say this person is not going to give a fair evaluation of the work, I'm not going to invite that person. I have had colleagues tell me that people have tried to exclude entire universities or countries, and that's taking a little bit too far. That's probably not something that we can feasibly do. Personally, I think that postdocs, other early career researchers, can be great reviewers because they are most connected with the literature, yet have the expertise to know if an article is sufficiently novel and timely. And if you're a more established researcher, a PI, senior investigator, you can feel free to include your trainees, especially for reviewing the reviews. It's just courteous to let the editor know. I mentioned conflicts of interest. I get asked about this all the time, so I just wanted to add a few points about this. Editors can catch some of the most basic conflicts. If there's multiple publications between a suggested reviewer and an author of an article in the last few years, I think that's a little bit too close to be an objective source of opinion. If you're currently collaborating, especially, or if you have affiliations in common. So, if you're from the same department at the same university, or the same branch of a government organization, something like that, I probably won't invite that person to review. Some things that I don't consider a conflict. So if you've published a few papers together in the past, especially if it's a many author study or one of these consensus statements, I think that's fine. I think you can still be objective. If you previously collaborated, previously visited each other's labs, especially if it's long enough ago, I think that's fine. And then if you've done other professional activities together, panels, conferences, if you are co-academic editors of a different journal, I think that's fine too. But there are some important sources of conflict that the editor usually cannot catch. If you're starting a new collaboration, you haven't published together yet, it's hard for me to know about that. If you're personally friends or if you're married to each other, I might not understand that. And so if I accidentally invite somebody's spouse to review, I really, really hope that they tell me I can't do it because I'm too close to this person. And finally, if you had a long ago mentor-trainee relationship, I'm usually not digging into your publication history decades ago. And so if you postdoc in somebody's lab in 2002, and I invite you to review their paper, I don't necessarily know that, but it would really help me if you're forthcoming about that relationship. Now, okay, I know your time is busy. I know you have a lot of obligations. Let's say that you get that email inviting you to review a review manuscript. Why might you want to accept it? I promise there are good reasons. The sort of buy-in payout of, okay, I submit research and then I know that somebody else needs to review my research, that I think tends to be an easier sell for research articles than for review articles. Because even if you're invited to review a review, you may never write a review yourself. However, I still think there are really compelling reasons that you might want to be a peer reviewer for a review article. First one, they're short, they're easy to read. It's not going to take that much of your time, especially relative to a complicated research article with a lot of statistics and a lot of interesting data that you have to sort through. You might learn something. So I'm inviting you because I think you're an expert in at least some aspect of the review, but I publish a lot of things that are so multidisciplinary that no one person can really be an expert in the whole thing. For example, I just had a manuscript submitted that was about algae and using algae to synthesize platform chemicals. And so I had to invite reviewers that were experts in algae biology and bioengineering and process engineering. And no one person was an expert in the entire thing, but synthesizing their comments gave me a better sense of whether the manuscript is interesting enough to publish. It's really, really good way to make a relationship with an editor, whether that's a professional editor like me or an academic editor in a different journal. I'm asking for thoughtful, constructive comments, and if you give that to me, that's a really great way for me to understand that you're an authority on the topic, and maybe I invite you to write a review in the coming weeks or months. And finally, maybe the most important scientifically is that, again, going back to the idea of a review article having a really broad audience and being used to teach the field to new people, you have a say in how your own field is presented. So you can see how another expert wants to pitch the field to non-experts, and then you can add your voice to that by providing constructive comments as a peer reviewer. If you don't think you can do it, if you get an invitation and you just can't review, that's totally fine. Time and travel are the most common reasons. Sometimes I get emails from prospective reviewers saying they're on maternity leave, and obviously take care of your baby, not my manuscript. I had one guy tell me that a tree fell on his house and he needed to clean up. Obviously, I don't expect you to review for me under those circumstances, but just tell the editor. It's okay to decline, I promise. I do appreciate if you give a short reason. You don't need to type a whole paragraph. I really appreciate if you tell me whether you're willing to review for me in the future, and it's best of all if you can just provide one or two alternatives, people who are also experts who also might accept the invitation. If you never respond, I can't be sure if you ever got it. But the worst of all is if you do respond and you say, yes, I'll review, and you never submit your comments. Because in that case, I'm spending time chasing you to give your comments when I could be looking for other reviewers. The authors are getting frustrated because there's a delay, and it's sort of sitting around in our submission system with nothing apparent happening when we could be making the process go forward if you would just communicate with us. All right, so really getting into, I think, the meat of this topic is, let's say that you're convinced, you get the invitation, you think, yes, I love reviewing reviews now, I can definitely do it, there are no trees in my house. What do you comment on? I'm going to focus on three things: accuracy or lack thereof, duplication, and confusion. So the first thing, scientific accuracy is the single most important reason that you were invited. I invited you to review the review because you are a bigger expert in this scientific topic than I am. What are we looking for here? So, are the scientific concepts that are explained in the review, are they correct according to how the field understands them right now? There's going to be a lot of terminology. There might be, abbreviations and glossaries and that sort of thing. Do the authors use those terms in a way that the field considers acceptable and correct? Is the most important recent research cited? When I say recent, I usually mean the past 2 to 4 or 5 years. Other reviews journals might have different standards, so make sure that you understand what the journal is going for. When you're talking about those recent publications, are the authors presenting the data and the conclusions faithfully? So have they interpreted what the author of the research article said correctly, and are they then conveying that message correctly to the readers of the review? Does the manuscript cite anything that has been disputed, discredited, even retracted? I actually had this happen to me a couple of years ago where the authors of a review manuscript cited a study that they were not aware had been retracted because the results couldn't be replicated, and one of the reviewers caught this because they're closer to the literature than I am. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but sometimes authors give hypothesis versus try to present the prevailing opinion in the field versus give what are undisputed facts because they've been seen in multiple experiments. As a reviewer, I really want to make sure that you comment on whether you think that's accurate. So for instance, if the authors have their idea about how something works, make sure that the authors are saying that this is our idea rather than inadvertently communicating that's what the entire field thinks. Finally, maybe most importantly of all, if a non-expert reads this manuscript, are they going to come away with a correct understanding of the topic as its practitioners see it right now? And if you think that a non-expert is going to read this and be confused, or even worse, come away with an incorrect understanding, that's maybe the single most important feedback you can give to me as a reviewer. So talking a little more about novelty, is this distinct from other recent reviews in the same topic? And it's not necessarily the case that if another review has been published recently, we can't publish a new one. We just need to make sure it's different enough. So maybe it considers the topic from a different angle, Maybe we're writing for a different audience. So maybe there's a bioengineering paper that previously has been reviewed in a biology context, and now we're reviewing it in a chemical engineering context. I think that's sufficiently different to merit a new review, but I think it's up to the reviewers to tell me where the scope is and how we might be able to play with the scope to make sure it's actually a new thing. Also, maybe if you're writing a more opinionated review or a perspective or an opinion article, if you're interpreting the same results differently, that could also be grounds to publish a new thing. And finally, yet again, I want to drive this home, is the main message clear? So maybe the authors don't have perfect grammar and usage, maybe they're not native English speakers, that's totally fine. What I want you to comment on is whether you can understand what they're trying to say. Every manuscript that we publish is going to get copy edited, so all of those inconsistencies will be sorted out. But on a more fundamental scientific level, do you understand the point of why this manuscript has been written? Are the authors saying anything at all, or just regurgitating results? I'm sure everybody's read review articles that do a really nice job of listing current research and giving an up-to-date bibliography, but they don't really say anything beyond just replicating what the authors of the research studies found. And those kinds of reviews can be okay if you just want to collate the results in the same place, but the best review articles are the ones where the authors give a perspective, maybe it's some comparisons, maybe it's some directions for future research. And so as a reviewer, I want you to tell me whether the authors are just collecting results or if they're actually talking about the results. A few more minor points. So the topics that the authors choose to discuss, do you think their discussion is reasonable in terms of both manner and style? Sometimes you'll have the authors just spend a lot of time on their own results or their favorite recent publications, even if they're not from their lab, and they'll go on for paragraphs about details about how these results were obtained, how the experiments were conducted, and so on, and then essentially skim over 10 more papers in the next 2 sentences. We want to make sure that things are presented in a balanced manner, and so as a reviewer, I would like you to comment on if the results in the review are presented proportionally to how important you think they are to the field. Speaking of detail, I'm most interested in conclusions from the cited research. I'm not that interested in the experimental setups or even the underlying data. And I think the most important thing in a review article is for the authors to synthesize and not to reproduce. There might be some very new relevant articles. This might even be in the context of preprints, or it might be in a research journal's most recent issue that was published after the authors wrote the review. That's useful for me to know because I'm not necessarily that up to date with where the research in the field is, at least compared to you as a reviewer. And I would say if you want to ask the authors to cite your work, that's fine. You're an expert too, right? But in that case, please use common sense, use humility, don't ask the authors to cite 40 of your own papers. At the very least, then the author is going to know who the reviewer is, but at the worst, that could constitute a major ethical violation. We don't want to be involved in that. Also, if you have any comments on the structure, that's useful for me. So for instance, maybe the authors have tried to cram a lot of quantitative information in the text. I see a lot of things with specific concentrations and wavelengths and experimental durations, those sorts of things. I think that's better presented in a table than in paragraphs, so you might want to comment on that. Is there a clear reasoning behind how the text is structured? So maybe it's from basic to applied science, maybe it's a historical organization. Any of that's okay, but make sure that you understand why the authors have organized their information as they have. And if there's not a clear reason behind it, maybe point that out to the editor too. And finally, on figures, this goes back to the point that I've been making about the authors simply reproducing research results versus actually commenting on them. I see figures all the time have panels A through J, and they're just little tiny pictures of data from research articles. And maybe some of them are bar graphs or spectra or pie charts without a lot of context. And I don't feel that really adds much to insight or to the point of the review. So if you see a lot of that, maybe give the author some suggestions for ways to make a more informative or abstract figure. We see, tiny small text and labels and colors that don't have a clear meaning. So if you don't understand why the figure is important to the manuscript or what the authors are trying to do with it, please comment on that also. Things not to worry about. Punctuation, formatting, grammar. So the editor knows how articles are supposed to be formatted. That's our job. Often I'll get reviewer comments along the lines of, oh, the limit is supposed to be 3,500 words, but this manuscript is 3,628. Yes, that's true, but I can check that very, very easily, and I can give the author some suggestions for how to reduce that, or maybe it's fine if the author exceeds it by a couple of percent every once in a while. Comments that are much more helpful about length are along the lines of, okay, well, the historical perspective didn't add much insight. Everyone in the field already knows this. There's really no point to include it. So rather than commenting on, oh, this didn't meet the journal's formatting guidelines, maybe give the authors a way to revise their manuscript so that it is a better fit for the journal's aims and scope. Reviews in most journals are going to be thoroughly copy edited and typeset. This is certainly the case for the trends journals and Cell Press, and it's true of many, many other reviews journals too. What do copy editors and typesetters do? Well, many things, many valuable things, but in this context, they're going to fix grammar and usage errors. They're going to make sure punctuation is correct. They're going to fix style inconsistencies like US versus UK English, bracketing, reference formatting, italics, everything like that. So if you really, really want to comment on these things, you can. I'm not telling you that you're not allowed to, but also I understand that your time is valuable and you have a lot of things to do, and I would much rather have you give a general impression of the interest and the novelty and the timeliness of the topic than really have to dig in and say, okay, the authors misspelled the name of this bacterium on line 263. It's important to point out that not everything classified as a review manuscript is exactly the same. And this is going back to what I mentioned earlier about understanding what the journal is looking for in terms of its guidelines. Some questions to focus on here is what level of referencing is appropriate? So if you're reviewing a perspective or an opinion piece, maybe they don't need many references at all. The trends journals that I work on should comprehensively include that sort of 2 to 4 year sweet spot, but don't need to cite every paper ever published. Like we don't need to go back to the 1980s and find the foundational studies. Some review styles, on the other hand, should do that and should be exhaustive. For instance, if you're reviewing one of these annual reviews kind of papers, then make sure that everything published in that year has been included. So this goes back to understanding what the journal wants you to do as a reviewer. Speaking of that, understand whether the journal wants author perspectives. I think many of the best reviews do encourage that, or whether it should just sort of neutrally summarize the data. This style might be more appropriate if you're reviewing something like a book chapter, for instance. So in that case, it might be less appropriate for the authors to talk about what they think and more appropriate just to list what has been done. In some cases, in some formats, there are strict limits. So for instance, we publish an article type called forum. And this is meant to be a sort of introduction to an emerging topic to a broad audience. In my journal, forums are strictly limited to 1,500 words without exception. And so as a reviewer, you might list a bunch of things that would be good for the author to do, but also it's important to realize that not everything you suggest can necessarily make it into the article all the time, just because of how the journal needs to maintain its space. And finally, some formats like original data, sometimes meta-analysis is okay or even encouraged. At the trends journals, it's not, but that doesn't mean that that's universal. And so, yet again, understand the journal's specific instructions. If you don't feel like you understand it, if you think there's some sort of disconnect, If you're confused, please contact the editor. It's our job to help you out. All right, so let's say that you have read through the manuscript, you've made your comments on the major issues, the minor issues, you have not corrected the author's spelling or punctuation, and you're ready to put it all together. How do you want to do that? Well, again, your task is to help the authors improve the review, help the editor publish something worthwhile. You're not there to attack it. You're not there to try to tear it apart or poke holes in it. You're not a defense attorney. You're a peer. Be nice. Be courteous. Do unto the authors as you'd have them do to you. Remember, these are your colleagues. Review goes both ways. It might help you to organize your thoughts if you want to give a summary of the manuscript. For reviews, I don't think this is required because the review should summarize itself in the abstract and introduction pretty clearly. If you want to do this as a way to organize your own ideas, that's fine, but don't feel compelled to. I find it helpful when the first paragraph of the reviewer comments gives a broad summary of what you think the manuscript's strengths and weaknesses are, if there's any major weaknesses at all, and a succinct recommendation about how the authors need to improve it to merit publication, or whether it's mostly okay to publish on its own already. And then once you've gotten that done, talk about your major concerns and your minor concerns. You can either do that in terms of what you think is the most least important, or you can structure it according to the sections of the manuscript. So, okay, in section 3, here are my major concerns, here are my minor concerns, and so on. It doesn't matter to me how you do it, as long as I can follow what parts of the manuscript you're talking about in each section of your review. And then really, this seems obvious, make sure your comments are consistent with your ultimate recommendation. So sometimes I see a reviewer recommend reject and then say, oh, this is a pretty good review, it has the following flaws. And to me, that's not grounds for rejection. That might be a pretty big revision. On the other hand, sometimes I see somebody recommend to reject the manuscript and it has some very good reasoning, or I might have a recommendation of minor revision, yet the review makes clear that the manuscript really shouldn't be published at all. So make sure that what you're commenting is consistent with what you're recommending. What to recommend? The way I suggest looking at this is if you imagine an average researcher who's interested in the topic but not a deep expert on the specific subject of the paper. So think about this person in your mind. It might be a colleague, it might just be a hypothetical person, it might be somebody you meet at a conference. Can this person understand the manuscript? Does the manuscript give her an accurate and current representation of the topic? And will she learn something unique from this manuscript that she couldn't just get by reading another article? I think those are really the key points of whether a review article is worth publishing. In terms of specific recommendation words, this is going to vary greatly by journal. You're usually given like a drop-down or a choice of radio buttons to say what your recommendation is. And the specific terms the journal uses are going to be different. But in general guidelines, you might have something like accept, minor revision, major revision, reject. I suggest looking at it this way. So accept means that the manuscript meets those criteria perfectly already. And maybe it could be improved by fixing some of the language or formatting, but in terms of scientific quality and in terms of clarity, it's already good to go. Minor revision I see as, well, it does meet the criteria, but there are still some important improvements that could be made. Maybe extending the discussion, making the figures clearer, making the perspective, the message stronger, or clarifying some potentially confusing technical terminology. If you want to recommend major revision, I see that as a manuscript that doesn't currently meet those criteria above, but they should be possible once the authors have had a chance to revise it. So I think major revision is appropriate for a manuscript where the topic is interesting and timely, the authors are trying to say something novel. If a review is published in this field, it should get pretty good attention, yet there's a lot of inconsistencies or the author's explanations are muddled. There might be some scientific inaccuracies. Maybe they just need to start over in a given section because it doesn't make any sense or doesn't relate to the rest of the topic. I think that's all appropriate for what we'd say is major revision. And finally, I don't think that reviews should be rejected unless the manuscript is so deeply flawed that it can't possibly meet those criteria even after significant revision. So a reject recommendation might be appropriate if the topic is just not interesting to the field at this point, if the authors clearly are not sufficient experts to be providing the perspective that they think they're providing, or if the review is just cumulative and doesn't actually give the readers anything new relative to other reviews that already have been published. I would say some degree of revision is by far the most common recommendation for review articles. Accepting with no revision is rare, and at least in the trends journals, rejection is relatively rare too, because as editors, we've already sort of put our stamp on it and said, yes, we like the topic. So I think it's my job as an editor to try to help the authors improve the manuscript, try to save it maybe, rather than say, okay, no, we're rejecting this without any further revision. And finally, consider whether re-review is necessary and whether it would help the authors. So by re-review, I mean the process by which the authors submit a revised manuscript and then I send it back to the reviewers to provide their comments on the revised version, in addition to the comments on the original version. This happens all the time for research manuscripts. It's pretty rare for research manuscripts not to be re-reviewed, but re-review for a review article is a little bit rarer. And the idea here is that maybe if the authors don't have the ability to fix the deep flaws of the article, then it doesn't matter how many times we review it, they probably still won't be good enough to publish. On the other hand, for really minor revisions, things like clarifications or extra discussion, the reviewer doesn't necessarily need to see it again. One thing that I really strongly ask of you is that if you recommend re-review in your decision, please be available to re-review the manuscript. One of the most frustrating things for me as an editor is when somebody says, okay, my recommendation is revision with re-review, and then I send the re-review invitation and the reviewer declines it, saying they can't do it or they're not interested or something like that. All right, so after you submit your comments, what happens? Well, this is pretty similar to research manuscripts. The editor is going to wait for a sufficient number of reviews and then send the recommendation and along with some comments to the authors. I get questions all the time about how many reviewers we invite. One is usually insufficient just for fairness to the author. So if I get one set of pretty harsh comments, I don't feel comfortable making a decision based on that alone. On the other hand, if I get one set of relatively sparse minor comments, then maybe I haven't done my job sufficiently to help the author improve the manuscript. If I get two sets of comments and they're pretty similar, they say consistent things, give the same recommendation, that might be enough. Three can give me more confidence, especially if the first two are sort of split in their lines of thinking or tell the author to take the manuscript in conflicting directions, then I'll usually wait for a third review. And I think there's typically diminishing returns beyond that. Very rarely we'll have 4 reviewers provide comments, but I find that it's rare that the 4th reviewer really adds a lot beyond what the first 3 already said. Then assuming that the decision was some sort of revision and not a rejection at that point, the authors are going to revise according to the reviewers and the editor's comments. The editor decides whether the re-review and then re-revision is necessary, as I described before. I typically reserve that for cases where multiple reviewers said the manuscript would benefit from re-review, or when the revisions are highly technical and they're things that I don't think I have sufficient scientific expertise in to assess whether they're correct and whether they're valuable. And then finally, the editor is going to ultimately accept or reject the manuscript. I would say that multiple re-review cycles are very rare. So, with research articles, you might get the same manuscript as a reviewer 3 or 4 times as the authors have worked through your recommendations. That's really not going to happen for a review article. Usually after 1, maybe 2 revisions, we have a pretty good idea of whether we want to accept it or not. So I'd like to wrap up by summarizing with 10 do's and don'ts of peer reviewing review articles. Number 1, do be professional. Use language that you wouldn't be offended to read if it was your own paper. So put yourself in the shoes of somebody who has submitted a review manuscript and you're getting the comments back. If you feel like you would be shocked and disheartened and offended to receive the comments that you just wrote, perhaps see if you can rephrase them to be more diplomatic and more constructive. Do invite your trainees to contribute. Inform the editor. I think there's some controversy about whether or not this is appropriate for research articles just because of the confidentiality involved. With a review article, this is a lot less of an issue because there's not any new data. There's not any new things except for the author's interpretation. So this can be a really great teaching tool into helping your trainees understand how to be independent peer reviewers. Do inform the editor of any conflicts of interest, especially those that we are not well equipped to detect. Don't commit to reviewing if you know you can't meet the deadline. On the other hand, maybe you say, okay, I'm really interested in reviewing this manuscript. I can have it done in 3 weeks instead of 2. Is that okay? The editor is usually going to say yes. But if you do agree and there's an unexpected delay, something significant happens that takes you away from your review assignment, that's fine. We get it. Just inform us as soon as you can. As you're commenting, do pay particular attention to scientific accuracy. This is the #1 reason that you've been invited to comment on a paper. Also comment on things like timeliness, clarity, accessibility, novelty. I hope I've gotten that across. Don't feel compelled to what we call line edit. So, this is like fixing things like grammar or reference citations. Somebody else will do that for you. You can use your valuable time in other ways. Don't recommend re-review again if you can't commit to reviewing the revised manuscript. And finally, as I conclude all of my talks, ask the editor if something isn't clear, if you want guidance. This is our job to help you. You're doing a favor for us, so we are available to help you do it in the best way possible. Thank you very much. Feel free to reach out with any questions. I hope you found this valuable, and I hope that you check out all of our other great resources in Researcher Academy about how to be an effective peer reviewer.